In the business world, it's dog eat dog, and you need every bit of competitive edge you can possibly get. Whether you're a salesperson, an entrepreneur, a small business owner, or corporate executive, you've landed on the podcast that gives you that edge and more. This is the Business Coach Unplugged Podcast. Exploring the strategies, tactics, and mindset shifts needed to elevate your business and leadership skills to new heights. Your host has walked the walk. He's coached thousands of clients to remarkable results and rubbed shoulders with legends like Tony Robbins, Ken Blanchard, Jack Canfield, and Brian Tracy. It's practical advice, inspiring stories, and the occasional dose of tough love, helping you to overcome challenges and seize opportunities. This is the Business Coach Unplugged Podcast. And now your host, owner of Potential in Motion, coaching you to the edge of what's possible, Tom Kelly.
Welcome to the Business Coach Unplugged Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Kelly. Today I want to talk about something that I think almost everybody listening to this has experienced at some point in their career, probably multiple times, losing a deal that you really thought you were going to win. Now, before we jump in, I want you to think about a specific situation. I don't mean just the general idea of losing a deal. I want you to think about one specific opportunity where you walked away from the conversation thinking, yeah, that went really well. Maybe it was a prospect you had been talking to for a few weeks. Maybe it was a big opportunity. Maybe it was somebody that you were genuinely excited about working with. In your mind, you started connecting the dots. You started thinking, this is a great fit. They need exactly what we do. This is going to move forward. And then, nothing. They disappear, or they hit you with, let me think about it. We're going to hold off for now. We've decided to go in another direction. Or maybe the worst of all, they just ghost you completely. Now you're sitting there frustrated, confused, replaying the conversations in your head, trying to figure out what happened. If you're like most people, your brain immediately goes to one of a few places. It must have been price. Maybe the timing wasn't right. Maybe they found someone cheaper. The reality is that every once in a while, that's true. However, after coaching salespeople, business owners, and executives for over 24 years, I can tell you this with a lot of confidence. Most deals are not lost because of price. They're lost because of how the conversation was led. I know that's probably not what you want to hear as it puts responsibility back on you, but honestly, that's also the good news. Because if the issue is the conversation, then it's fixable. Now, what I want to do today is tie this back to something I've talked about before on the podcast, my 4-step sales process. I'm not going to reteach that process today, as you can listen to that episode for a deeper dive on the process if you want. Instead, I want to walk you through where sales conversations actually break down inside of it. Because once you understand this, you start seeing these patterns everywhere. And more importantly, you stop losing deals that you should be winning. Let me start with a coaching conversation I had recently. I had a client call me after losing a pretty significant deal. When I answered the phone, I could immediately hear the frustration in his voice. You know that tone people get when they're trying to sound calm, but you can tell they're irritated? That was him. He started walking me through the situation. Tom, this one makes no sense. They had the exact problem we solve. They loved our process. We had great meetings. They kept saying how helpful the conversations were, and then they just disappeared. So I asked him, what do you think happened? And without hesitation, he said, it had to be price. Now, what was interesting was that a couple of days earlier, I had another coaching call with a different client in a completely different industry. That deal closed. As I compared the two conversations, the difference wasn't price. It wasn't the product. It wasn't even the prospect. The difference was how the conversation unfolded. One conversation stayed surface level. The other one went deep. One conversation was led with curiosity. The other one was led with assumption. And honestly, this is one of the biggest mistakes I see in sales. People move too fast. The second they hear something familiar, they jump into solution mode. Trust me, I understand why. You hear a problem and your brain immediately goes, oh, I know exactly how to fix that. That's experience. That's pattern recognition. But the problem is, just because you understand the problem doesn't mean the prospect fully understands it yet. This is where deals quietly start to fall apart. Let's slow this down and walk through what typically happens. You get on a call. You start asking some questions. The prospect starts talking about what's going on, and somewhere along the way, they mention a challenge. Maybe sales are down. Maybe turnover is high. Maybe they're struggling with accountability. Maybe they don't have a consistent process, and the second you hear it, you think, yep, I know what this is. Now your internal engine starts going. You start thinking about recommendations, solutions, ideas, and case studies. You start mentally preparing your pitch. Now here's the crazy part. From your perspective, you think you're helping. You think I'm adding value. I'm showing expertise. But from the prospect's perspective, they're not there yet. They're still processing the problem. They're still trying to fully understand what's actually happening, and that disconnect matters more than you realize. Because while you're mentally moving towards the solution, they're still emotionally trying to understand the problem. Eventually, that gap shows up, usually later in the sales process or when you ask for the business. That's when you hear things like, we need to think about it, or this is really interesting, which, by the way, is one of the most dangerous phrases in sales, because interesting is not commitment. Interesting is surface level. Keep in mind that people buy with their emotions and justify with logic, and if they haven't emotionally connected to the problem yet, they usually won't buy. So let's talk about step one in the process, identifying and exacerbating the problem. Now, if I ask most salespeople whether they ask good questions, almost everybody would say yes. But asking good questions and truly developing the problem are two very different things. Most people ask enough questions to understand the issue intellectually or at the surface level. Very few ask enough questions to create emotional clarity. There's a massive difference between these two things. Let me give you an example. A weak sales conversation sounds like this. So what are you trying to improve? Well, we want to increase revenue. Got it. And then they move on. That's surface level selling. Now let me show you what a deeper conversation sounds like. So what are you trying to improve? Well, we want to increase revenue. Okay, what's driving that? Well, things have been kind of flat lately. Flat compared to what? Compared to where we thought we'd be this year. Got it. What impact is that having? Now notice what's happening. You're slowing the conversation down. You're staying curious. You're not rushing to solve the problem yet, and eventually, when you stay in the conversation long enough, people start telling you what's really going on. You start hearing things like, honestly, it's creating pressure internally. Our ownership team is getting frustrated. I'm concerned about where this is heading. Now you're somewhere real. Now there's emotional weight behind the problem. This is where a lot of salespeople get uncomfortable because they think they're making the prospect uncomfortable. But here's the reality. If the problem is real, they already feel uncomfortable. You're just helping them articulate it. And when people clearly articulate a problem, they become more motivated to solve it. Remember, clarity is power, especially in sales. I remember working with a business owner a few years ago who was struggling with employee turnover. Initially, the conversation sounded very logical. We just need to improve retention. Okay, fair enough. As we kept talking, though, eventually he admitted something. He said, Tom, honestly, I'm exhausted. I remember there was this long pause after he said it. Then he said, I feel like every time we get somebody trained, they leave. Then I've got to start all over again. It's affecting my family life at this point. Now think about the difference between those two conversations. One is operational, the other is emotional. One creates awareness, the other creates urgency. That's why this step matters so much. Now let's talk about why people skip this step. Most of the time it's not lack of knowledge, it's fear and discomfort. Salespeople are afraid to stay in the tension. They're afraid they'll come across as pushy. They're afraid the conversation will feel awkward. So instead of slowing down, they speed up. They go right to the solution. Honestly, I used to do this early in my career. I thought selling meant having the answer. I thought the value was in telling people what to do. But over time, I realized something. The best salespeople don't rush to be the expert. They stay curious longer than anyone else. That's what separates the best salespeople from the mediocre ones. Now, once the problem is clear, we move on to step two, helping them identify and visualize what the solution looks like. This is another place where I think salespeople move too fast. They hear the problem and immediately start explaining their solution. However, there's a difference between hearing a solution and emotionally connecting to an outcome. One of my favorite questions to ask is, if I could wave a magic wand and make this exactly the way you want it, what would that look like? Then I shut up and listen. I don't rush past it because most people haven't fully thought through that either. This is where the conversation starts to become exciting. Now they're not talking about pain anymore. Now they're talking about possibility. And when people start describing what success would actually look like, something changes emotionally. They start leaning in. They start visualizing it. They start wanting it. I had a client recently who said, if we could get consistency in our sales process, I feel like I could finally breathe again. Think about that statement. I could finally breathe again. That's emotional. That's human. That's real. And if you move too quickly, you'll never get there. Now we get to what I think is the most important step in the entire process, step number 3, determining what is preventing them from solving the problem. Because if they could have fixed it themselves, they probably would have. So something is in the way in preventing that from happening. If you don't identify what that is, then your value is weak at best. I had a client once who was convinced his prospect's issue was lack of strategy. After we walked through the conversation together, I told him, I don't think strategy is the real issue. So he went back and dug deeper. Eventually, the prospect admitted, we actually know what we should be doing, we just don't have accountability. Completely different issue. Now, instead of selling strategy, he was solving execution. That changed the entire conversation, which, by the way, is why generic pitches fail. People don't buy generic solutions. They buy solutions to their specific problems. Now let's talk about step 4, which is defining the value proposition. This is the step that I think gets skipped the most. Not because salespeople don't know it's important, but because most salespeople feel uncomfortable having the conversation. What's interesting is that most salespeople think the value proposition is something they say. They think it's their pitch, their presentation, their explanation of why their product or service is valuable. But that's actually not the most powerful form of value. The most powerful value proposition is the one the prospect gives themselves. That's the difference. And this is where so many deals fall apart. You can do a decent job uncovering the problem. You can even help the prospect talk through the solution. You may even identify what's preventing them from solving it. But if you skip the most important question, if I can help you solve this problem and get the outcome you want, what is that worth to you? You're probably going to lose the sale. That question changes everything because now the prospect has to quantify the value. Now they have to emotionally and financially connect the dots. What I found over the years is that most salespeople never slow down long enough to have this conversation. They rush right into pricing. They rush right into proposals. They rush right into telling people what it costs before establishing what the problem is costing them. That's backwards. That's skipping steps, and when you skip steps, you lose the sale. I remember working with a client years ago who sold consulting services to small businesses. Really smart guy. Great at building relationships. People liked him immediately, but he kept getting crushed on price, and he couldn't figure out why. He kept saying, Tom, everybody tells me I'm too expensive. So I listened to a few of his conversations. After about the third one, I realized exactly what was happening. He was presenting his fee before the prospect ever emotionally connected to the cost of the problem. So his number felt expensive because there was no context around value yet. I remember asking him, did you ever ask them what this issue is actually costing them? He paused and said, no, not really. So we changed the conversation. Instead of rushing to the proposal, he started slowing down and asking questions like, what is this currently costing the business? What happens if this continues for another year? How much revenue do you think is walking out the door because of this? What would solving this actually mean for you financially? Then all of a sudden, the conversations changed completely. Now the prospect wasn't comparing his fee to zero. They were comparing his fee to the cost of staying stuck. That's a massive shift psychologically. This is one of the biggest mistakes salespeople make. They defend their price instead of building value. Those are two very different things. Weak salespeople defend price. Strong salespeople build value so effectively that price makes sense in comparison. Let me give you a real simple example. Imagine somebody has a business problem that's costing them $250,000 a year and your solution costs $25,000. If they clearly understand the cost of the problem, your fee feels small in comparison. However, if they never emotionally connect to the $250,000 problem, then all they see is the $25,000 expense. That's why step 4 matters so much, and is also why so many salespeople hear objections like, that's more than we expected. We need to think about it. We don't have the budget. A lot of times those objections are not really about price. They're about insufficient value. The prospect never fully connected the cost of the problem to the value of the solution. Now let me be clear. Sometimes people genuinely can't afford something. Sometimes timing is really bad. Sometimes there are legitimate obstacles. But in my experience, most of the time when somebody says it's too expensive, what they're really saying is, I'm not convinced the value outweighs the cost. Those are very different things. One of the questions I love asking in this part of the conversation is, if we solve this successfully, what does that do for you personally? Now, why do I love that question? Because people don't just buy business outcomes, they buy emotional feelings. Maybe solving the problem means less stress, more confidence, more freedom, more income, a better family life, less pressure, or greater security. And when people emotionally connect to what solving the problem actually means, their decision-making changes. That's why step 4 is so important. You're not manipulating people. You're helping them fully understand the value of solving a real problem. If you skip that conversation, then yes, price will feel high because value was never fully established in the first place. Now let's talk about price for a minute. This is where salespeople usually think the deal is won or lost. In reality, price is usually just where the weak value gets exposed. If the problem is vague, if the outcome isn't compelling, if the emotional connection never happened, then yes, price feels high, even if it's reasonable. However, when the pain is clear, when the desired outcome feels meaningful, and when the cost of staying the same feels heavy, then price becomes relative. This is why two people can hear the exact same number and react completely differently. One seeks cost, the other sees value. So let's bring this all together. You're probably not losing deals because of price. You're losing them because the conversation stayed too shallow. You moved too fast. You solved too early. You assumed instead of exploring. The solution isn't to become more aggressive at the end. It's to slow down at the beginning. Stay curious longer. Ask better follow-up questions. Stick to the process and don't skip steps. Get people emotionally connected to both the problem and the outcome. Because when you do that, then the sale stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like the next logical step. If you found today's episode useful, you can also access a number of free resources that will help you improve your business as well as your leadership on my website at www.businesscoachchicago.com. Also, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn as I would love to connect with you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please click the subscribe button, leave a review, and of course, invite your friends to listen in as well. I'm Tom Kelly, and until next time, enjoy your week.
You've been listening to the Business Coach Unplugged Podcast. On this highly useful podcast for people in the business world, you get the absolute top-notch info from an absolute pro on how to elevate your business and your leadership skills. Tom Kelly owns Potential in Motion, coaching you to the edge of what's possible. He's also a professional speaker and leadership trainer. He's worked with some of the biggest names in the coaching business: Tony Robbins, Ken Blanchard, Jack Canfield, Brian Tracy. To sign up for a complimentary coaching session and to access some great free resources, hit the website at businesscoachchicago.com. Your success is not just a possibility, it's a certainty. See you next time on the Business Coach Unplugged Podcast.